They thought the fire would silence him forever, but when the clock struck 12, the dead man came calling. The wind howled through the trees like a mourning spirit, dragging mist and shadow behind it as it swept across the cursed village of Elderbrook. Tucked away in the forgotten creases of the world, far from the reach of cities and kings, this village was a place where time stood still and the veil between life and death wore thin. The year was 1784, though to the people of Elderbrook, dates mattered little. What ruled their lives was fear, an ancient fear passed from one trembling generation to the next. Elderbrook stood at the edge of a massive, primeval forest that many believed was older than time itself. Its trees loomed like watching gods, their twisted limbs blotting out the sun in places where even animals dared not tread. The villagers whispered that the forest breathed, that it could hear lies, and that it sometimes took people who didn't belong. In the heart of this village, on a night draped in fog and dread, a great fire crackled in the center square. Around it gathered the people of Elderbrook, wrinkled faces, hollow eyes, and the nervous chatter of children too young to understand the weight of what they were about to hear. The flames cast long, warping shadows against their pale faces, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and old fears. At the edge of the crowd sat an old woman, her back hunched with time and her face carved with stories. She was the keeper of tales, the one who remembered what others were too frightened to speak aloud. Her hands trembled slightly as she leaned toward the fire, and her voice, raspy and slow, pierced the heavy silence. "Tonight, we remember Edric," she began, her words tasting like ash. The children leaned in, wide-eyed. The adults shifted uncomfortably. "He lived among us, though many wish he hadn't. He was different, kind, quiet, too gentle for a world like ours. And for that, we feared him." The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the cold air. The old woman continued. "They say he walked with the wind and listened to the trees. That he spoke in forgotten tongues and knew the names of stars." Her eyes found the horizon where the forest loomed like a waiting grave. "But do you know what truly damned him? He never raised his voice. Never fought back. And when the village turned against him, when they dragged him to the stake, he only said one thing." The children didn't breathe. "He said, 'At midnight I'll come.'" Silence followed her words. The flames danced higher. Now, to understand the terror that gripped Elderbrook, we must step back, into a time when the world was ruled by shadows, and the people clung to ritual like a shield against the unknown. Elderbrook was a place untouched by enlightenment. There were no books, no science, only scripture and superstition. The village church, an ancient stone relic blackened by centuries of candle smoke, served as both sanctuary and gallows. Here truth was what the elders declared it to be. Justice was fire, and mercy was an illusion. It was during one particularly cruel summer that the rumors began. The crops had failed. Cattle were born still. A plague of sickness swept through the children, taking their laughter and leaving behind shallow graves. And when desperation claws at the throat of a community, it doesn't take long before it finds someone to blame. That someone was Edric. Edric had always been an outsider. He lived on the edge of the village, in a crooked little cottage surrounded by herbs and wildflowers. He spoke to birds and often wandered into the forest, returning with strange roots or mushrooms the villagers didn't recognize. He mended wounds, delivered babies, and healed the sick with tonics that smelled like pine and pepper. But for every life he saved, the fear grew. Fear that he owed his talents to something unnatural. Fear that he answered to powers far older and darker than any church. It was the mayor, Godwin, who first dared speak the accusation aloud. A tall, cold man with a jaw like iron and eyes that saw only black and white, Mayor Godwin was the beating heart of Elderbrook's fear. His sermons were thunderous, his punishments swift. To him, the world was a battlefield between divine order and wicked chaos. And Edric, in all his quiet compassion, was a disruption to that order. "He is not like us," Godwin declared one morning. "And that is enough." Some disagreed. One voice in particular refused to fall silent. Mira. Mira was the blacksmith's daughter, a girl with fire in her heart and questions on her tongue. She had been a child when Edric nursed her back from fever, and she never forgot the gentle way he had sung to her as he crushed herbs by candlelight. She was 17 now, and she watched the village with sharp, defiant eyes. She saw their fear, their need to purge whatever they couldn't explain. And she saw that Edric's kindness frightened them more than any spell or demon. Still, her protests fell on deaf ears. The villagers had made up their minds. They came in the night with torches and rope, knocking at Edric's door like wolves in sheep's clothing. And Edric opened it. He did not scream. He did not beg. He walked with them, barefoot and solemn, as the sun began to rise over Elderbrook. By the time the fire was lit beneath him, the square was full. Mira pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her cheeks, pleading, shouting, sobbing. "This is wrong!" Godwin ignored her. The flames rose. Edric turned to Mira one last time. His voice was soft, barely audible over the roar of fire. "At midnight," he said. "I'll come." Then the fire took him. And from that moment on, nothing in Elderbrook was ever the same. When the fire finally died, and only smoldering ash remained of the stake where Edric had been tied, a silence fell over Elderbrook like a funeral shroud. Smoke hung in the air for hours afterward, refusing to lift, as though the sky itself mourned what had been done. The villagers dispersed with heads bowed, eyes averted, and hearts heavy, but none spoke a word. Only Mira remained. She stood at the edge of the charred circle, tears streaking her soot-covered face, staring at the blackened earth where Edric had last drawn breath. Her fists were clenched at her sides, trembling, not just from sorrow, but from something deeper. Something sharper. Guilt. Rage. And a whispering voice in her heart that said this was not the end. The ashes were still warm when Mayor Godwin ordered them swept away. "Let the fire cleanse him," he proclaimed before his congregation that evening. "Let the devil's mark be wiped from our soil and our souls." But his words rang hollow, even to those who had once cheered for justice. Something was off. The air itself seemed restless. The birds had stopped singing. The hounds that roamed the village refused to approach the town square, whining and retreating with tails tucked low. The church bells rang every hour that day, a tradition meant to drive away lingering spirits. Yet the sound felt wrong. Warped. Each toll echoed unnaturally, fading into a silence too deep, too absolute. By nightfall, a storm began to stir in the distance. Thunder rolled far off over the hills, though no lightning split the sky. The clouds churned like ink spilling into water, and the villagers locked their doors tighter than usual, barring shutters and muttering old prayers their grandparents had taught them. Mira, meanwhile, couldn't sleep. She paced her room, candle in hand, her mind filled with Edric's final words. "At midnight I'll come." A threat? A promise? A curse? She didn't know. But she remembered the way he'd looked at her, the gentleness in his eyes. No hatred. No fury. Just certainty. As if the words weren't spoken by a man, but delivered through him by something older. Something inevitable. The clock struck 11. Down the street, the innkeeper's dog began to howl, a low, mournful wail that turned the blood cold. Then came the knocks. Not on one door, but on several, one after another. Faint, deliberate. As if someone was going from house to house, tapping gently with the back of a knuckle. Tap. 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 No one answered. By 11:30, the village was gripped by a panic none dared speak aloud. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers stood by windows with axes and pitchforks. But the knocking never came to their doors again. It passed by, like a drifting mist, as if searching for something. For someone. And then the clock began to chime midnight. 1, 2, 3. By the sixth chime, Mira had moved to her window. Her candle flickered wildly, nearly extinguished by the sudden draft that wasn't there moments ago. She could see the square clearly from her home, and she felt it before she saw it. The wind stopped. The trees outside froze in place. 10, 11, 12. Then, from the heart of the village, came a sound that froze Myra's breath in her lungs. A knock. Not just any knock. His knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the door of the mayor's house. Mira ran to her door, yanking it open and stepping into the night. The air was thick, as if the atmosphere itself had congealed into something too dense to breathe. The clouds overhead pulsed like veins in a skull. And there, at the top of the hill, standing before Mayor Godwin's door, was a figure. Tall. Still. Cloaked in shadow, but glowing faintly, as if the fire had never truly let him go. Edric. Myra's heart slammed against her ribs. It couldn't be. He was gone. She had watched him burn. She had smelled the flesh melt from his bones. But he was there. And she wasn't the only one who saw him. From behind curtains and through keyholes, villagers peered out in terror. They saw what Mira saw, a man wrapped in smoke and flame, his face obscured, his hands blackened, but unmistakable. He raised his hand. And knocked again. Boom. The sound echoed through Elderbrook like a thunderclap. Inside the house, Mayor Godwin stirred from sleep, drenched in sweat. He sat bolt upright in bed, eyes wide with dread. He knew. Somehow he knew. No dream could bring this kind of fear. No nightmare could summon the chill that now crept through his bones. He reached for the holy book by his bedside, his lips fumbling over words he no longer believed. The knocking came again. This time, it splintered the wood. Godwin screamed for his guards. None came. They were outside, staring from afar, paralyzed. Mira moved forward, drawn by something she didn't understand. Her feet carried her across the square, past the still burning torch that marked where Edric had perished. She could feel the heat return, not from the fire, but from the man who stood before her. She stopped a few feet away, trembling. Edric? She whispered. The figure turned to her. His face was half shadow, half scorched, one eye glowing like an ember, the other as pale as moonlight. Yet in that face she saw him. The man who had healed her. The man who had walked into death without fear. And something else, something older, burned behind those eyes. I told them, he said. His voice was layered now, as though a dozen voices echoed behind it. I would come. Then he looked back at the door, and it burst inward without him touching it. Screams followed. The house lit up from within with a red-orange glow, brighter than firelight, more alive than flame. Shadows danced behind the windows, shadows of things too large to belong to men. And above it all, Edric stood. Silent. Unmoving. As if watching justice take form. The villagers would never forget what they saw that night. How the mayor's house burned without smoke. How the flames left the nearby homes untouched. How, when morning came, the house had vanished entirely, leaving only a ring of scorched earth and blackened stone. And of Edric, there was no sign. Only a trail of ash that led into the forest. Mira followed it. She would not let him vanish again. For she understood now. This was not vengeance. It was balance. The morning after the fire, the village of Elderbrook was different. It was not the kind of change one could easily see, for on the surface, things appeared normal. The sun rose over the treetops, casting its golden light on the village as it always had. The old church bells chimed the hour, and the villagers went about their daily chores, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes lingering on the square where the mayor's house had once stood. But beneath the calm exterior, the air was thick with something else, an unspoken awareness that something had shifted. Mira did not return home. The whispering wind in the trees called to her as if it knew what she was seeking. She knew the forest like her own skin, but today, it felt unfamiliar. It felt as though the woods had grown deeper, darker, more alive. She had always feared the forest, as all children in Elderbrook did. It was a place where the light barely filtered through the thick canopy of ancient trees, where shadows could swallow you whole, and where the very ground seemed to breathe beneath your feet. Yet it was also a place of whispers, of forgotten stories and half-remembered legends. The villagers would tell tales of those who ventured too far into the woods, never to return. But in her heart, Mira knew the forest had always called to Edric. She remembered how he would disappear into its depths for days at a time, returning with strange gifts and cryptic words. Now, the forest had taken him. But not in the way they thought. With a determined heart, Mira crossed the edge of the village and stepped into the woods. The moment she passed the first row of trees, the air grew thicker, colder. It wasn't just the chill of the morning mist, it was the presence of the forest itself. Every step she took seemed to disturb the quiet that hung in the air like an ancient spell, and the trees watched her with their gnarled limbs, bending closer, as if listening. The path was narrow, overgrown with vines and moss, and barely visible in the low light. But Mira pressed on, feeling the pull toward the heart of the forest. She didn't know why, but she had to follow the trail, follow the ashes that led into the shadows. Hours passed as she walked deeper into the woods, the sun barely a memory in the thickening gloom. The trees grew taller, their trunks widening and twisting like ancient serpents. The further she went, the quieter it became, until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as though the forest itself was waiting. And then she heard it. A whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it came again, louder this time, like a voice on the edge of her hearing. It was soft and breathless, but familiar. Mira. She froze. It was his voice. Edric's voice. But it wasn't the gentle, soothing tone she remembered. This voice was different. It was deeper, layered with a darkness that made her skin crawl. It came from somewhere ahead, but she couldn't see anyone. No one was there. Mira. She followed the sound, moving carefully, her every step deliberate. The path was now a shadowed tunnel, the trees pressing in around her as though they were guiding her towards something, towards someone. She didn't know how long she walked. Time seemed to lose meaning in the forest. The shadows thickened until it was nearly impossible to tell where the land ended and the sky began. But through the murk ahead, something gleamed, a faint, flickering light. Her pulse quickened. She was close now. The light grew stronger, and with it came the sound of rustling leaves, the low groan of the forest as if it were breathing with a life of its own. Then, through the dark veil of the trees, she saw him. Edric. Or something that was Edric. He stood at the edge of a clearing, his back to her, his form outlined in the eerie glow of an otherworldly fire. His body seemed to shimmer, as though he were made of smoke and shadow, barely tangible, barely real. His hair was wild, his clothes tattered and torn, as though they had been burned and reformed in the very flames that had claimed him. Mira. The voice that spoke now was a chorus, his voice, and yet not his own. It echoed in the air, reverberating from the trees, from the earth, from the very sky above. You found me. She stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. Edric? Her voice was shaky, torn between disbelief and longing. But you're not. He turned slowly, his face half shadowed, half glowing in the light. His eyes, those eyes, were not the same. One was bright, glowing red, like embers burning from within, while the other was pale, lifeless, and sunken. It was as though the fire had taken part of his soul and left the rest behind, twisted and broken. No, he whispered, his lips curling into a grin that was not kind. I am what the fire made me. What the forest made me. I am the balance. The reckoning. Mira took a step back, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. What do you mean? You were dead. I was, he agreed softly. But death is a door. It is not an end. Not for those who know the forest's secrets. Not for those who are chosen. Chosen? Myra's voice trembled with confusion and fear. Chosen for what? You said you'd come for justice, but this isn't justice. Edric's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. The fire didn't burn me, Mira. It didn't burn away what was necessary. The forest kept me, and in return, it has made me its keeper. Justice, you see, is not something you can simply hand to men. It is a force. A living thing, and sometimes, it needs a hand to guide it. Suddenly, the air around them shifted, and Mira felt a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder. Spinning around, she saw nothing but trees. But as she looked back to Edric, something darker was shifting behind him. You must choose, Mira, he said, his voice now an echo of 1,000 others. You must choose whether you walk with me, or leave this place forever. You will never leave it the same. Mira swallowed, trying to steady her breath, her heart racing in her chest. What happens if I choose to leave? You will lose your soul, Mira. The forest will claim it. And you will forget who you are. His eyes burned into hers, and she felt herself drawn to him, pulled by some unseen force, as though she was already part of something much greater, much older. Mira felt a tremor run through her. But as she looked into his eyes, she remembered the man he had been, the healer, the protector, the one who had cared when no one else would. She remembered the truth that had been lost beneath the fear and the fire. She could not follow him. Not like this. I choose neither, she whispered, stepping back. Edric's face twisted in fury, and the forest around them groaned as though it were in pain. Then the reckoning begins, he hissed. And the ground beneath her feet trembled. The earth beneath Myra's feet cracked open with a sound like thunder, sending a tremor through the forest. The air grew thick, choked with the smell of burning leaves and wet earth. The trees around them groaned as if in agony, their branches twisting unnaturally, stretching toward the sky in impossible angles. Mira stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her choice, but the consequences were now clear. The forest, which had always been a thing of mystery and fear, had come alive in a way she had never imagined. It was no longer a place of whispers and shadows. It was an entity, a living force, and it had chosen Edric to be its herald, its guardian. But Mira had chosen the path of defiance. She would not walk with him. And for that, she would pay. The forest seemed to breathe around her. The wind howled like a maddened beast, whipping through the trees and tearing at her hair. The ground beneath her feet trembled as though it were waking from a deep slumber. And in the clearing, Edric, no longer fully human, but something more, smiled a terrible, knowing smile. You do not understand, he said, his voice rising in pitch, growing darker with every word. The reckoning is not for me, Mira. It is for the village. It is for the ones who condemned me, who burned me alive without understanding. Justice is not mercy. It is not forgiveness. Justice is balance. And now, the balance is tipped. Mira turned and fled, her feet slipping in the wet earth as she sprinted back toward the edge of the forest. But she could feel the forest pulling her in, drawing her deeper, faster, as though the very trees were reaching for her. Every step she took was met with resistance, as though invisible hands were tugging at her, holding her back. Behind her, she could hear Edric's voice, no longer human, but a voice that resonated from every corner of the forest. It echoed in the leaves, in the wind, in the very earth itself. Run, Mira, he called. Run, and you will lead them to their end. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. She could only hear the rising sound of the forest, of the trees creaking, the ground shaking, and the wind howling like a storm that had come to tear everything apart. As she reached the edge of the forest, she saw the village in the distance. Its stone buildings stood like silent sentinels against the horizon, but now, they seemed more distant than ever, more fragile. Myra's heart thundered in her chest. She knew she had to warn them, but the weight of what she had witnessed, the transformation of Edric into something else, something unnatural, held her in its grasp. She turned to face the village, but as her gaze swept over the land, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The forest was moving. Not just the trees, but the very earth beneath the village was shifting. The earth was cracking open, wide fissures appearing in the soil, swallowing up the ground like a great beast awakening. The trees, thick and ancient, uprooted themselves and began to march toward the village, their roots twisting like serpents, their branches swaying as though alive. Edric had not lied. The reckoning was upon them. As Mira stood frozen in shock, she saw the figures of the villagers gathered in the square, their backs turned, unaware of the impending doom. The flames of their bonfire still flickered, the smoke rising into the sky, but it was the smoke of destruction now, not celebration. With a great cry, Mira ran toward the village, but her legs felt heavy, as though she were wading through thick mud. Her lungs burned with every breath, but she pushed on, faster and faster, determined to reach the village before the forest did. She burst into the square, stumbling to a halt in front of the mayor's house. The villagers turned, their faces filled with confusion and fear. "The forest!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. "The forest is coming for us! We have to leave, now!" But no one moved. The villagers just stared at her, their faces blank, their eyes wide. The old woman, who had once told the tale of Edric's fate, stood at the edge of the crowd, her expression one of resignation. She had known what would come. She had known that the forest would claim what it had lost. Mayor Godwin, tall and unyielding, stepped forward, his expression darkening. "You bring chaos, Mira," he said, his voice cold. "You bring fear. We will not be swayed by your superstitions." "But you don't understand," Mira cried. "This is not a curse, this is justice. Edric, he—" Before she could finish, the ground shook once more, and the first tree reached the edge of the square. Its roots slithered into the earth like dark tendrils, pulling the soil apart, opening up a chasm beneath the villagers' feet. The villagers screamed in horror, but it was too late. The reckoning had come. The first of the trees crashed into the stone buildings, toppling them with ease. The sound of splintering wood and cracking stone filled the air. The fire that had once burned in the village square was now a blazing inferno, and the flames twisted, rising higher, reaching toward the heavens as though they were hungry for more. Mira turned to run, but the forest had already reached them. The trees swarmed the square, their twisted branches wrapping around the villagers like chains, pulling them into the earth, pulling them into the darkness. And through it all, Edric's voice echoed in the wind, a chorus of the dead and the damned. "At midnight I'll come," he had said. "And the reckoning will begin." Now, the reckoning had come for Elderbrook. The village was no more, and the forest claimed it as its own. Elderbrook was no more. The trees that once stood as silent witnesses to the lives of the villagers now stood as grave markers, their roots deep in the earth where homes, hopes, and lives had once flourished. The village, once so full of whispered prayers and superstitions, was now a place of silence, its very existence swallowed by the forest, as though it had never been. Mira stood at the edge of the ravaged square, her heart heavy with loss and disbelief. The wind had stilled, leaving only the distant rustling of leaves in the thick forest that had claimed the land. The flames had long since been extinguished, and the cries of the villagers had faded into nothingness. Now, there was only a deep, oppressive silence that seemed to settle in her bones. She was the last one left. Her hands trembled as she stared at the blackened ruins. The fire, the destruction, it had all happened so fast. The terror had overwhelmed her, but the aftermath, the quiet that followed, was even more suffocating. There were no bodies to mourn, no graves to visit. Only ashes and earth. Edric had warned them. He had said the reckoning would come, and it had. But now that it was over, what was left? Mira had made her choice. She had defied the forest, refused to walk the path Edric had chosen. But in the end, what had it mattered? The forest had already claimed the village, already rendered it to dust and memory. The reckoning was not just for the villagers, it had been for the land itself, for the balance that had been upset by fear, hatred, and ignorance. Myra's thoughts drifted back to the night of the fire, the flames that had consumed Edric, his last words echoing in her mind. "At midnight I'll come." Had that been a curse? Or had it been a promise? Perhaps both. The truth was, Edric had not been the one who had been destroyed. The forest had made sure of that. What had died in the fire had not been a man, but a symbol, an innocent soul lost to a world too afraid to understand him. And what had risen in his place was not a monster, but a force of nature, a reckoning for all those who had stood against him. Mira knew that now. The reckoning was not a punishment, not a vengeance. It was simply the return of balance, nature's way of righting the wrongs done by the ignorant and the fearful. The forest had given Edric the power to restore what had been lost, to remind the world that even the dead could have a voice, that even those forgotten by history could rise again. And so, as the last ember of the village's fire died away, Mira understood that her role in this was not to fight or to resist, but to remember. To carry forward the legacy of what had happened in Elderbrook, and to ensure that its story was never forgotten. Edric had not been the devil. He had been a part of something much older, something that the villagers had failed to see. They had feared him because they did not understand him, and in their fear, they had condemned him to the flames. But now, the truth had been revealed. The forest had risen, and with it, Edric had been reborn, not as a man, but as a force, as a symbol of the natural world's power to reclaim what was rightfully its own. Myra's journey was not over. She knew now that she could not remain in this place. The land that had once been Elderbrook was no longer a home for her. The forest had claimed it, and in doing so, had claimed the village's story as well. But the legacy of Edric, the legacy of the reckoning, would live on. Mira would take it with her, carry it far beyond the borders of Elderbrook, to the world where fear and ignorance still thrived. She would speak of the man who had walked with the wind, the man who had been burned at dawn, but who had come knocking at midnight. And she would ensure that his story was told, so that others might learn, so that the balance could be restored once more. As she turned to leave, Mira heard something in the distance, a faint, whispering sound that made her pause. It was the sound of leaves rustling, not in the wind, but as though something, or someone, was moving through them. Slowly, she turned toward the forest, where the trees stood silent and watchful. And then, as though from the depths of the earth itself, a voice, Edric's voice, called to her. "The reckoning never ends," it whispered, carried on the breeze. Mira knew that this was true. The reckoning would never end, not as long as fear and misunderstanding persisted. And so, as she stepped away from the ruins of Elderbrook, she carried with her the weight of the forest's story, knowing that one day, someone else would have to carry it forward, just as she had.